Thanks so much for joining us here today. John Kane Luncheon. What an honor it is for myself to be speaking here today, and I guess introducing myself as well. As many of you know, a regular attendee of this wonderful series, so it's very nice to be playing in front of our own crowd. Now, before I begin, I did, of course, hold on. I want to start by acknowledging that we all meet tonight on the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to recognise their historical and continuing role in caring for the lands and waterways that sustain us all. I've had the good fortune in my career to work alongside some fantastic young First Nations activists from an organisation called Common Ground. And they've always highlighted that when we acknowledge the country, we so very rarely actually acknowledge the country on which we meet. So given that I'm here today to talk about industry policy in part, I want to acknowledge the impact that our industry has had on these lands and the contributions that it has made to the changing climate of this place, which has gone through sustainable cycles for at least 65,000 years of documented stewardship by First Nations of this country. We need to centre the knowledges of First Nations communities in how we respond and adapt and above all else mitigate the effects of this rapidly changing climate, whose impacts are already ravaging the country across this land. I want to acknowledge as well that this has always been a place of meeting, of discussion, of debate and understanding. And it is in that spirit that we stand on this country, in this place and in this time. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and move forward in the understanding and solidarity with the First Nations of this country and express my sincerest hopes that the treaty making and truth-telling process that has been started here in Victoria is one that acknowledges the divisive and harmful past, but also brings us together and gives us all a voice and a role in shaping our collective future. I want to end by acknowledging that these are lands that were stolen and never ceded, and acknowledge that this is, was, and always will be Aboriginal. Now, comrades, again, thank you so much for coming out today to listen to me speak. For those that I haven't met yet, my name is Shirley Jackson. I'm the inaugural director of the Centre for New Industry here at Capita. Whoops, that's why I'm supposed to do that. It's an applied research centre that is committed to economic diversification, decarbonisation and democratisation. Now, if you'll indulge me, I'll give you a brief overview of the purpose of the centre and what we see as our mission before talking about the importance of economic democracy, building a safe, sustainable and secure future for all in the post-carbon economy. So the idea for the centre came from reading the research and seeing clearly the problem that lies at the heart of the moment that we all find ourselves in, facing catastrophic climate change, a tense and increasingly unsuitable economy that is not providing for all who occupy it, and a looming skills crisis that sees millions of and underemployed at the time when industry is crying out for skilled workers. So we designed this centre as a way to propose policy solutions that support what famed economist and academic Professor Mariana Mazzucato calls a mission-oriented approach to industry policy, supported by reforms that increase the skill base within our economy, which allow us to capitalise on the opportunities presented to us and that provide sustainable, skilled, safe, and above all, secure work for all who want it. At the Centre, we see our role as building an evidentiary basis to support the bold reforms and interventions that promote what I've come to think of as the 3 Ds of economic development: diversification, decarbonisation, and democratisation. We believe that Australia needs a vision for the future that provides greater employment opportunities for workers and their families, greater stability and security for regional communities, and better equips Australia to respond and adapt to economic and industrial change. We believe that Australia cannot rely on top-down solutions to economic development. We must work with community, workers and firms to create a long-lasting, sustainable progress of economic growth. Our unique country, with its vast landmass and low population density, requires unique economic solutions to the challenges we face as a nation. And the Centre hopes that we can help support the development of these solutions by producing detailed yet accessible research that is grounded in the experiences of people in place to explore skills formation, industry policy requirements, and a successful shift to a zero-carbon, full employment economy. To that end, we've established 4 research pillars that we hope will help guide our policy and advocacy work. The first pillar is industrial development and diversification. We believe that modern industrial policy is a process of working with a broad coalition of willing partners to develop mutually beneficial outcomes for both public and private stakeholders. Rather than the old adage of picking winners, this approach encourages a collaborative, tripartite approach to economic development, brings together governments, firms and workers to set targets for industry growth and to share and distribute the associated benefits as well as shoulder the risk. Successful industry policy shows that public institutions matter and make an impact on people's lives. An investment in creating new industries presents countries the world over with opportunities to produce value, both economic and social. Crucially, a mission-oriented approach to industrial policy rethinks the role of government in the economy, putting purpose first and solving problems that are important to citizens. It means transforming government from being perceived as merely an enabler or at worst a stifler of innovation, depending on which papers you read, to being recognised as the engine of innovation that it always has been. Smart industry policy incentivises research and development. It allows us to maximise innovation and domestic productivity. It provides concrete and specialised supports for experimental research to be commercialised with domestic industry partners and allows our best and brightest to revolutionise technology without growing overall. Modern industry policy must also ensure that benefits are distributed widely by including workers and their representatives in the planning, execution and delivery of industry growth plans. It also requires the implementation of adequate local content requirements and training ratios that maximise outcomes for local suppliers and for the workforce. Similarly, it uses the machinery of government to develop agglomerated precincts that provide easy access to industry partners, specialised infrastructure and reliable supply chains. But above all, it provides tangible benefits to community in which these strategies must be developed. When investing in smart industry policy, the benefits are potentially boundless. However, it requires a lot more to ensure success. Enter our second pillar, skills for industry. Australians are more educated than ever, yet employment prospects are increasingly varied. In particular, the growth in the knowledge and service sectors has led to a paradoxical situation where there has been some limited growth of highly paid knowledge economy jobs and a substantial increase in low-paid service sector jobs. This has led to a hollowing out of our skills base, where demand for intermediate skills in traditionally blue-collar professions has been eroded, and there has been insufficient investment in attracting or growing new industries that could utilise this crucial skills base. Increasingly, the choice for new entrants to the labour market is between investing in costly additional years of tertiary education to compete for a small number of available jobs in the knowledge economy, or continue to work in jobs in the service sector that offer low wages, little security, and often don't utilise the tertiary education or allow them to develop new skills. Yet a myth still persists that education is the best predictor of future employment outcomes, despite evidence that the causal relationship between education and employment has been eroded over time. I started doing my PhD here at the University of Melbourne Youth Research Centre. There's a fantastic study there called the Life Pattern Study, which is the longest running study of Australian youth. They've been recruiting their third generation, Gen Z. They also have a Gen Y cohort and a Gen X cohort who are now into their 50s and have still been surveyed every single year from when they're 16 through to their 50s, which is amazing. You really get to map that transition, and increasingly we've seen that predictor that I'm sure many of the people in this room were used to. For every additional year of post-secondary schooling that you did, there was an associated increase in income. We no longer have a causal relationship like that in Australia, which is very concerning for the next generation. So we believe that by investing in building specialised but portable skilled career paths, Australia can create a strong skills base for employers to utilise while maintaining the broadest amount of employment prospects for workers. By promoting cooperation, coordination and collaboration in the skills space and advocating for tripartite investment, the Centre will seek to improve the outcomes of both workers and firms in specific industries, from our aged care and advertising to space and shipbuilding industries. Now, our third pillar concerns industrial standards. At a time when cost of living pressures are rising and wages have been stagnant for decades, the need to address industrial conditions and relations is paramount. The focus on smaller and smaller units of bargaining have led to a generational experience of precarity, pressure, and powerlessness. By focusing on industry approaches to workplace standards, we believe that a new economy can be built on employment that is secure, safe, sustainable. This research pillar will contain work relating to the improvement of industrial standards across the economy. Rather than seeking to promote a top-down, race-to-the-bottom approach to the challenges we face, The Centre will promote solutions that lift industrial standards. In particular, attention will be paid to skilled work, obviously, and sectoral approaches that are reflective of the value being created by varying work across key sectors in the economy. Now, our fourth and final pillar is something we like to call new industrial models, which some of it will be quite laughable for people in this room because some of the ideas have been around for an awful long time, but we tend not to listen to them. The old becomes the new again. As our industrial profile changes, we need new ways of approaching economic management that maximise the benefits to all stakeholders in the economy, not just shareholders. We need to build a new economy that is more resilient, better managed, and has the ability to deliver better social outcomes for Australians. This research pillar will contain work that pursues a circular rather than an extractive model of local development, one which seeks to make the most of local institutions, businesses, and networks that are anchored within the community. We believe that traditional approaches to economic development, which treat all investment agnostically, does little to keep key production and essential services grounded in the communities that they're supposed to serve. Instead, we argue that there should be a focus on investment that have a long-term interest in the development of the community. By placing emphasis on place-based approaches, local ownership, economic multipliers, and collaboration, we'll seek to create new industrial models that deepen our economic democracy and maximise the benefits returned to the communities in which they are based. Now, for me, all the pillars are essential foundations for a better future in the post-carbon economy. And while the pillars are a bit like children, and I shouldn't have a favourite, in this case, the fourth pillar to me is the most exciting and essential work. Now, I've long been an ardent supporter and advocate for economic democracy and truly believe that we cannot leave our future to untamed winds of market forces. Economic democracy at its core returns to us the ability to shape our economic lives. As one of my heroes, Grace Matthews, writes in his seminal text, Jobs of Our Own, which I'm sure is familiar in this room, we should take it as our task to create a system that supports a society of owners where property belongs to the many rather than the few, and correspondingly opposes the concentration of property in the hands of either the rich, as under capitalism, or of the state, as advocated by some socialists. In particular, ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange must be widespread. This approach is squarely on the side of active citizenship, embracing the ideals of civil society. It freely acknowledges the need to reconcile the moral case for greater democracy in the workplace with the requirements of productivity to have productive organisations which are fair as well as efficient. No one says it better than race. While we have long had the benefits of a strong trade union movement here in Australia, and it allows us some degree of economic democracy in the workplace, and delivers in part some of what we outlined in that previous quote from Race, for far too long we've let that be just enough. In short, this only addresses one aspect, however crucial, of economic democracy. To simplify, political economist Andrew Cumbers describes economic democracy as having three key aspects: individual economic rights, diverse forms of democratic collective ownership, and the need for greater public participation in economic decision making. So firstly, some individual economic rights. Increasingly, workers in our country have little control over their economic lives. The growth of casualisation and the gig economy, as well as labour hire and other third-party contractors, have reduced our ability to decide when, where, and in what form we work. The exercise of agency and autonomy in the economic sphere is increasingly reduced, and our ability to rebalance it has been weakened over time. Through legislative reforms, the power of our mighty trade union movement has been reduced, and our internationally guaranteed freedoms to associate and withdraw our labour have been curtailed by specific, heavily regulated, codified and sanctionable scenarios. I believe that some of the movements are currently being made to address these aspects of our economic rights, with the government foreshadowing reforms that would increase the bargaining power of workers, better facilitate our ability to use it, as well as correcting the loopholes that have allowed multi-billion-dollar companies from having sham contracting arrangements with employee-like contractors, to reduce the ability of third-party contractors to maintain attractive opportunities for exploitation by enforcing site rates for all workers and regulating instances where casual work is allowable. However, the final form of these suggested reforms remains to be seen. It's up to all of us as part of a broader labour movement to ensure that these reforms are adequate and fit for purpose. The second aspect, namely the diverse forms of democratic collective ownership, is far too underutilised in the Australian economy. Now, there are many ways that we can boost this aspect of our economy, ensure that the benefits of growth are distributed more equally throughout our society. We can and should, for example, follow the experiences of Germany and implement co-determination legislation, which designates a third of all board seats in public, private and not-for-profit corporate companies between 500 and 2,000 employees, and half of those with 2,000 or more to be elected by the workers of that company. This helps to rebalance the operations of the enterprise in the interest of the company as a whole, not just the executive and its shareholders. Now, as a thought experiment, imagine if co-determination was enforced at Qantas during the pandemic. Would the company have laid off thousands of essential ground crew, baggage handlers and engineers? Would Alan Joyce have still received bonuses and additional stock incentives at a time when thousands were being thrown into unemployment as a result of his decisions?
No, they would have laid him off.
You'd hope so. And as well, would we be experiencing the drop in safety and service standards across the country as a result of this reduced capacity? Like yourself, I doubt it very much. Similarly, we could reform the Corporations Act to include the interests of employee ownership schemes and ensure that a reasonable percentage of stock in medium to large enterprises are retained for workers who make the companies profitable, with no option for buybacks for the company, ensuring that the company returns profit to the labour of its employees. They receive the benefit. These schemes are very active. We do have some in Australia, but very active across Europe. It's very much the norm in certain parts of the EU. We can also ensure that essential services, particularly those in the care economy, are kept in public hands. While there's little appetite for keeping these, where there is little appetite, I should say, for keeping these public services in public hands, instead of large-scale selling off public assets, we could do like France did with its shipbuilding industry and retain 51% ownership in public hands, and including workers' ownership, and lending the final 2% of voting rights to the majority to the private operations as majority shareholders, under the provision that when they no longer deliver in the public interest, the state can resume control and right the course and return to the public interest. Crucially, however, we must create better incentives and supports for cooperatives and mutuals to compete in the marketplace. First, we need to create dedicated investment vehicles for cooperatives. There's far too many co-ops that pass a business case fail to access funding through private channels. We can also offer, when we see important companies that have crucial links into the community, for example, when the Weiss company, I'm not sure if everyone remembers, the Weiss bars, everyone might have had one of those mango and cream bars at one time. When they were sold off to Unilever, the family that had run Weiss, since it was started, had their factory based in Toowoomba. They sold it with the proviso that absolutely they needed to keep operations happening in Toowoomba. And as soon as the deed was dried, they sold the factory in Toowoomba and moved it and rationalised it to their Ultimo factory. Now, they just paid the fine and kept moving because it's worth far more to them to rationalise it and maximise shareholder profit than it is to keep it in the community, right? And honour their word. So I think it would be a really great idea if we offered workers the first right of refusal to purchase and maintain operations. Similarly, we could also implement social procurement policies that preference cooperatives and other democratically owned enterprises as primary contractors, and more importantly, throughout the supply chain. And finally, turning to the third aspect of economic democracy, the ability for public participation in our economic decision-making, we could begin to experiment with participatory budgeting at all levels of government. For those unfamiliar with the term, participatory budgeting would allow for citizens to allocate funds that would be distributed in local, state or federal budgets based on their preferences, which are aggregated across the jurisdictions and delivered by said levels of government. This could take the form of the citizens' dividend, where a certain percentage of the budget is allocated to an equal share for every citizen, and they decide with their dividend where their dividend will be spent. Adrian can tell us a lot more about that. Or it could be akin to the kinds of digital tools that we see utilised by the media when these sorts of things come up. People could vote on which percentages should be spent in which departments, which projects should receive an appropriate amount of funding. And all of that could be collated and recommended to the government, to the treasurer or the local government as a suggestion for the overall distribution of the economy. Finally, we could also experiment with direct democracy by utilising citizen juries, where ordinary people are brought together by local, state, federal departments through a jury-like sortition mechanism. and spend a number of days being presented with the problem, the evidence, the arguments, and the solutions, and then they're required to vote on a course of action. Now, this has already been utilised by Big Health here for a couple of initiatives, which have had some very promising outcomes. And finally, we could even explore the idea of having Swiss-style referendum mechanisms in direct democracy, whereby, you know, any petition that reaches a certain percentage of the citizens could be put to a referendum. Now, none of the ideas I've presented here today are actually that new, and most of them have worked to varying degrees around the world in countries abroad, or in many cases already exist here in Australia. We don't have the appropriate weight of institutional support to function at maximum efficiency. However, it's my belief that the time to explore new approaches to economic management is now, as we seek to rebuild in the wake of a once-in-a-generation crisis. We owe it to ourselves and to our children to leave the world just a little bit better than we found it. And I believe that economic democracy offers us a really credible chance. Thank you all for listening to me today. I look forward to continuing the discussion through your questions. Questions? Yes.
I just wondered what your view is of the Labor government's seeming embrace of Beetaloo, Adani, that, you know, the massive increase which would blow our commitments to zero many times over.
Yeah, I mean, personally, not a fan. I know that's a really quick and easy answer, but
No, do you think there's a strategy in place?
I think very much it comes down to how committed we are to stopping these things, right? Like, the only reason that decisions like this happen is because it's not politically volatile enough to reverse it. So I think the only way that we can do it is as a broader Labor movement and environment movement and community groups across the country, all of which speak pretty strongly against these ideas. But I think one of the big challenges that we face, and we've always faced, particularly in places like Mackay, now Isa, you know, places that are really reliant on mining. And we often talk about mining as not employing that many people in the economy, about 1.5 to 2% given on the year. But it's increasingly and incredibly place specific. I wrote a paper in 2019, I think it was, called At the Coalface, where I sort of analysed the 3 areas where the primary employment industry is mining. And if we pull the mines out, if we flip that switch tomorrow and pull that out, it's not just that those workers that lose their jobs. Of the next 5 to 7 industries, at least 4 of them will be dependent on there being a primary industry where workers have high wages and they spend back into the local economy. So if we don't have credible plans for the next economy, the next industry to come in, then we're never going to be able to convince workers on the ground that we've got better to do. So I think that's where it comes in, having smart industry policy that's based on what are the local resources, what is the local skill base, what are the supply chains, what are the sorts of building blocks that we have available for us in a place like Mackay or you know, Collie or wherever we're looking.
But we all know that greening the economy has more jobs.
Has more jobs in the construction phase.
Future.
Has more jobs in the construction phase. Often when we hear the headline figures of how many tens of thousands of jobs will be made, 80 to 90% of them are in the construction phase. For example, like Beyond Zero Emissions Million Jobs Report, 87% off the top of my head are construction phase jobs. There's increasingly small amounts. And that's because the new technologies are efficient, they're effective, they don't break down very often, they require a handful of skilled workers to maintain. So I think that we need to be honest about what type of jobs will be created and where, and stop trying to sell people on a macro story about a clean economy and start grounding in this project with this many jobs, this many which will be ongoing in these skilled areas. Does that make sense?
Isn't it about being on the ground with people and talking to them?
Absolutely, and giving communities a say in their future is absolutely paramount. Some of you would have come across the report that Sam and I did, Blueprint for Better Cleaner Jobs, where we advocated absolutely for communities to be put into the decision-making process because they know better than anyone what they need. And particularly if we build the kinds of supports for cooperatives and mutuals like we've seen happen out in Latrobe. I'm sure many are aware of the Earthworker Cooperative, which has started up down there and is bringing heavy industry back one little piece at a time, growing sustainably in the community with the community. These are really exciting developments. Now, anyone from the Valley will tell you that the Latrobe Valley Authority wasn't perfect. If you talk to the Gippsland Trades and Labour Council, you'll hear a lot of things that weren't perfect. But even they admit it was better to at least have a conversation and to be able to feed in at some level. And so we're really hoping to learn from those examples. I'll be doing some work on the college just transition. We've gotten some money, so we'll be going over in October to speak to the community, to the local stakeholders. We've also got Karen Kane, who was the CEO of the Latrobe Valley Authority, who's coming across with us. She set up a new advisory consultancy, which is really, really fantastic. Her and Nick Decker, who was the head of bushfire recovery in Victoria, and also worked at the Latrobe Valley Authority. So we'll be doing some of this work, hopefully should be launching a paper around December, and we're really hoping to, exactly like you're saying, making sure that communities are leading what's happening. But where communities are resistant because they're lured by the filthy lucre of a project like Adani or any of the other projects, then it's up to all the rest of us to be able to present clear, concise, grounded projects that might offer a better way forward, if that makes sense. I have a couple of others. You want to go back to you. So, what was your name?
Renata.
Renata. Nice to meet you, Renata.
What about gender issues? Surely these are really important in this, expansion of
Yep.
that?
Absolutely. So the question for those on Zoom, sorry, I forgot to repeat the first question, but it was about the gender implications and the gender effect. Australia has one of the most gendered industrial profiles in the world. We have, industries like mining and heavy industries that are 90%, 70 to 90% male. And then we have, obviously, at the other end, particularly the care economy and other service jobs, we have workforces that are 85, 90% who are made up by women. Now, we have a lot of interesting ideas that get thrown around in this space and trying to get more men to go into the female-dominated industries, and then that'll just solve it all overnight. But we already know that the men that work in education and healthcare, they're also more likely to end up in management positions. They're also more likely to rise ahead of women who have been there for far longer and far more qualified. So absolutely, we need to have very clear, and we've got some of really good infrastructure, like we've got the Gender Equality Agency, which people have to report to. But year after year, people report really bad findings and nothing much gets done about it. So I think, again, it's one of these things that's around willpower and around trying to find those unique and policies with bite, if I can put it that way. Now, I won't speak too much to this because Emma has a lot of work coming out soon, but definitely we are talking about how we can do this best and what are the ways that we can rebalance our workforce and make sure that we're getting more women into male-dominated industries that are good jobs, but making sure that when they get there, they're not staying at the bottom rung. We have a lot of programs that get young women to come along and try the construction trades for a lot of the time. And what we see is young women tend to come in and they're doing traffic management, they're doing spotting, they're doing dogging, they're doing rigging, they're not crane operators, they're not getting to, like be leading hands, they're not getting to, so we need to make sure that we're building those credible pathways through for women in male-dominated industries. And we need to make sure that there are those new projects in heavy industry that have always been good, solid union jobs. But we need to make sure that we're lifting up the other industries as well. We can't just say, we just need to get more blokes into those industries and everything will take care of itself. We need to make sure that care work is valued, is supported, and is properly remunerated and made secure again. So, yeah, Emma will have many more papers in this space, and we're working on as well an industry policy for the foundational economy, which will be coming out hopefully this year. But yeah, a bit of a watch this space moment, but absolutely it's crucial to the success of the new economy if we don't rebalance for gender. Fantastic. Janet.
Look, fabulous paper, and I think this is going to be so important because we get into government, we fix a lot of things, but how do we actually provide a vision and a whole plan? Just in talking about it though, I think particularly Greens need to know about this. We have multiple examples around the world of the tragedy of deindustrialisation. Yes. And what happens, and it's gendered because men start to die. And they die, there was up to 20 years difference in life expectancy in Glasgow's corridor of death, which they now can relate to the people who were children and in utero when the shipyards were closed. It's what happened in the end of the Soviet Union. It's still there in Bendigo and Ballarat. It's still in the Latrobe Valley, and Bendigo and Ballarat were left losing a huge amount of their long-term industrial product with participant. And those people, they might have a housing commission house, but that's all they've bloody well got. And so the despair and the drug abuse and the mental illness, and then that goes on to the next generation. So you actually create horrendous and horrible problems. And the north of England turned from villages who were great, powerful social communities with bands and choirs and clubs and football teams and cricket teams, and now they're just full of drug addicts. And so it's not a trivial thing, and people know, and that's the other side of the gender coin, that the ones who lose out on big transitions are men, more than women, but the women connected to them lose out and their children.
That's right, all those social, sorry for those on Zoom if you couldn't hear Janet, everything's bad. No, generally when you see deindustrialisation come through, there are a lot of other associated gender implications, health implications, social implications, and how crucial it is that we make sure that we're having plans that rebuild these areas. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, and the other thing is a lot of these areas in Australia could be transformed into high-tech food production, which uses people who are good with logistics and good with automated systems and engineering and plumbing and electricity. And they're mine works. That's the word, mine works, really. And so you could, in the Hunter Valley or the Latrobe Valley, be actually having a huge amount of food production in a world that's increasingly losing its key food balls. That's right. Because of climate change.
We've got some really innovative solutions that have been happening in Australia, particularly in the agricultural sector. So one of the places that I always bang on about, because I'm obsessed with it, is Sundrop Farms, which is outside of Capita. So they grow, I think it's 60 or 70% of Woolworths tomatoes in a place that has no water, that is arid, that is dry. Coles, yeah, you might be right, Conrad, sorry. And it's fantastic, like when you look into it, they're utilising, water recycling, they've got their own solar array pans, they're using, like greenhouses and all of these, some old technologies, some new technologies, sometimes salt water, that's why they've got their own desalination plant on site as well. So, and I mean, everyone here who's tried to grow tomatoes, like knows how water intensive they are. So growing in one of the most arid places, like in our country is really, really exciting. So we've had some discussions as well with the National Farmers Federation, and we're really hoping that there might be some interest in what we can do to exactly build us back into a good food manufacturing nation. Food manufacturing has been very resilient. When we talk about the decline of manufacturing, food manufacturing and paper manufacturing have actually been very resilient and continue to be good jobs in Australia. But we really need to take seriously that challenge of deindustrialisation. Australia has a really bad track record when it comes to structural adjustments, right? Like when one industry closes. And the rule that we find consistently is the rule of thirds. So a third of the people who are laid off find, similar skilled work and similar rate of pay somewhere else in the economy. A third find unrelated work that is usually in the service economy, doesn't utilise their skills, is increasingly insecure, not the sorts of jobs that they came from. And a third never find work again. Now, I refuse to accept that a third of people finding similar work with similar paying conditions is the best that we can do in a country as rich and prosperous as ours. So, as we said in the blueprint report that Sam and I wrote, there are a lot of strategies that we can do to sort of boost these ones up. But I remember being out in the Latrobe Valley when Hazelwood announced that they were closing. I was at Trades Hall with good comrade David Craig over here at the time. And I was out there representing Trades Hall at a conference that was organised by the Fair Unity that was there. And they brought out some really fantastic scholars, and we had fantastic workshops with, local departments, local community members, unions, firms that were there, like everyone from across the community to talk about solutions. And there was an outstanding academic who came from the South Wales coalfields, a bloke called Carell Williams. I might be slightly misremembering his name, it was aggressively Welsh. And he always said, like, one of the problems that we face when, people come to these moments of structural adjustments, they start going for silver bullet solutions. They say, oh, we can turn, Bendigo into the next Silicon Valley. We can, attract Tesla to come set out this. And as he always points out, him and others in the care economy collective, why don't we make the jobs that exist better, right? So in regional areas, one of the fastest growing jobs is in aged care. We're not talking about making aged care the best in the world here in Australia. We're not talking about trying to make ourselves an aged care superpower, right? And we should be, absolutely should. Like, we should be taking care work seriously, as when the economy closed down under COVID, it wasn't, the tech bros that were out there keeping us going, right? Like, it was nurses, it was care workers, it was warehouse workers, it was retail and service staff that made sure. Those are the things that we can't live without. We need to start valuing them. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but absolutely we need to start valuing them and remunerating appropriately. You have a question. Sorry to see you, by the way.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So I have a question about how is it that you and I have a common comrade, Godfrey Morris,
yes.
And he's done some really interesting work in regards to Earthwork Cooperative, Red Gun Cooperative. And could you give us the backstory on how the NUW in fact started in terms of its work to democratise management, and where do you actually see the broader trade union movement in regards to how it can play a role in democratising workplaces when Labor is out of government?
Really excellent question from Adrian, one of my old comrades from the Fabian Society, and we were both involved heavily a couple of years ago. And a fantastic book on participatory budgeting and the sciences as well, which I highly recommend to everyone, which is what I was citing when I was reading my speech here. So very nice to have you here, comrade.
Thank you.
And he was asking me about the challenges that we face with cooperatives and working cooperatives, how the NUW now would sort of started to lead in this space, and what else we can do to make sure that we're continuing this work even if Labor aren't in government, if that's a fair summation.
Yeah.
I actually came off the floor for the NUW back in the old days. I was a warehouse worker in the print industry for a better part of 10 years. And my first job for the NUW was working on the JICO campaign, Jobs You Can Count On, which was about getting rid of labour hire. This was back in 2012, I think, when 12 of us were in a room saying we need to make people start paying attention to what's happening in labour hire, and started running a community campaign on it. Slash cut 10 years, and we've now got legislation and full institutional waiting behind keeping labour hire regulated here in Victoria, which is really exciting. So it sort of started, I think, very organically from Godfrey, particularly being the force of nature that he is, and TK, Tim Kennedy, who's now the National Secretary of UWU, was then the Victorian Secretary of the old NUW, being someone else who was committed to not falling into the same pitfalls that we always into, and start trying to imagine how we can get through. And I guess very much the conversation came from realising that we kept retreading those old debates about market versus the state, over and over and over again. And as Grace Matthews outlined so clearly in Jobs of Our Own, we can reject both of those as being the only solutions and try and collaboratively and collectively start managing parts of the economy ourselves.
Yeah.
And the NUW really started leading this space, just like they started leading the unemployed workers space, funding the unemployed workers. They started, providing seed and solidarity money to cooperatives. They weren't the only ones involved in Earthworker, obviously, but they certainly helped get it off the ground. I also remember they were the ones who funded the business case for, there was a Steggles factory in Adelaide, which was going to be shut down and offshored, and they wanted the workers to be able to purchase it, continue as a chicken operation in the outer suburbs of Adelaide. But again, they ran into this problem around how do we access funding. The banks won't give money to working co-ops because they don't see them as viable entities, despite decades, hundreds of years of evidence that absolutely working cooperatives can work. We only need to Mondragon in Spain to the scale that cooperatives can truly achieve. So it very much, I think, came organically through that, and they just saw it as a responsibility of the labour movement to not just be fighting on the shop floor, but to make sure that we're providing better opportunities for there to be further blues on the shop floor, right? Like to create more industry, more sustainably owned industry that are better for workers. Jumping on the second part of your question, it was around what we do outside of
what
Labor
makes the role
governments.
of,
Yeah,
trade further democratising the economy.
absolutely. So I think it's a really essential one, because the more that we can democratise our economy, the less reliant we are on governments to solve our problems. So I know that these discussions do happen through the workers' capital working group through the ACTU. I know that we talk about how we can be using workers' capital to serve workers' aims. Hopefully, we can continue down that path. I think our own industry super funds can be a really huge part of that solution. Some have different risk profiles and appetites for these sorts of things, of course. I'm going to make sure that we're first and foremost taking care of workers' retirements, obviously, but where we can share those aims, I think that's a really useful avenue. But also, when we do have governments, be it at federal, state or local levels, we should be making sure that they are building these parts into their plans. Like I don't think, or I don't see a lot of evidence that we're doing that at the moment. And I think it is that push, sorry, going straight into the microphone there, that push to make sure that when we are in government, we are setting up for it. And I think that, you know, too often when we're coming into power as a broader labour movement, we go, Jesus Christ, we've got a lot of work to do. Let's try and get it out. Let's try and do all the things that people have been asking us to do and waiting for us to come in and do when we get into government. But there's that always that push to look at the short term. And I think we need to make sure that as a labour movement broadly, both parliamentary and outside of parliament, obviously, that we are planning for those long-term sustainable futures. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that second part of your last question, but it's definitely something that we all need to keep discussing and making sure that we're prioritising. Okay, how are we doing for time, Meredith? Have we got
15 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. Any other questions, comments, discussion? Back to you. It's Bob, wasn't
I was
it?
going to ask you this probably two parts. Are we seeing increases in union membership now? And is it equal across the board? And second one, why doesn't the union movement be the bank for cooperative workers?
Yeah, very excellent point. Right. I think, you know, I'm speaking of Godfrey before. Sorry, the question was about how can we make sure that we're, can the trade union movement be a bank for cooperative movements? And what was the first part again? Sorry, I've got to focus on the second half because that's exciting.
Has there been an increase in
union membership, and is it equal?
Is it across the board?
I believe that we haven't seen a huge increase in the last couple of years. It's maintained, you know, roughly 1 in every 10 workers. We have started to see large upticks in certain industries, like across, speaking of the NUW and the Uwu now, farm workers all of a sudden are getting unionised. We're seeing, you know, union agreements be rolled out across the care work. Like we've been seeing, I'm sure we've all paid attention to the news, what's been happening in childcare and all the fantastic educators who have been working so hard for so many years to try and get recognition. That's been a long, slow burn. But at the same time, we are seeing a bit of churn because, and this I think is where the generational question comes in. Because as older people have been retiring, people who were, you know, came into a job and immediately joined their union, knew that was part of what we had to do at work. We haven't seen that translate across the generations. That's what I originally started my PhD on, was looking at why young people haven't joined unions quite so much. And so no longer are people being fed into trade union shops. That isn't their first experience. Their first experience isn't, you know, leaving school, going to nurses' college, going to the shop floor, going to teachers' college, whatever it is, where you're more likely to encounter big workshops where you'll be exposed to the union movement. And increasingly, you know, people's first jobs, and they're not just for a couple of years while you're a teenager, you know, young people are working in retail, fast food, hospitality, well into their 30s now. And, you know, you might be working in a workshop with 5 other people, you know, they're not all workshops, but you might be working at a site with only 4 or 5 other people. Now, there's a real resource question there for any of us who are trade union officials know. When you've only got so many organisers, you've got to try and chase the best members that you can, the largest membership. Now, it takes a lot more resources to organise across 100 sites that have 5 members potential than it does to find one site that's got 500 people on it. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing less and less of those 500 people sites opening up. And as I was sort of intimating in the start of our speech, I think there's been a bunch of changes that have lessened our capacity to respond to these changes. They've lessened our access, they've lessened our ability to be able to mobilise when we are on those shop floors. It's a complicated question, comrade. You can hear from my all-expanding answer, but no, we haven't seen a great uptick yet. I'm hopeful that we will start to see that, because when we talk to young people, the next generation who generally have been union members, it's not that they're not political. Young people today attend more political activities than did many of those in this room who remember the activities that were happening during the Vietnam War. Now we associate that as like, 68, that was the year of, revolution, that was the year of political activity, this was the generation to do all these things. Young people today absolutely quantitatively and qualitatively take far more political action, but they're not seeing formalised institutional structures as the way to achieve that change, and that includes the trade union, which is a real problem for all of us who are true believers in the trade union movement. And we have to accept some of our own collective responsibility in making some mistakes, as we all do, as we try and respond to unforeseen circumstances generation after generation. We encounter new challenges every time. But also we need to start taking them seriously and showing up. And I think, there are a lot of unions that I don't necessarily, UWU is one of them, that are showing that they are willing to step outside what they traditionally do. Not just good old workplace blues, which will always be important, absolutely. As a union official for the past 10 years, 100%. Now, first and foremost, we should be on the shop floor. But that can't be the end of it, right? So I think we're learning a lot in that space. And I guess that leads us to our second part. Should the trade union movement be trying to find some way to bankroll cooperatives and other, democratically owned solutions? I think that the conversation is turning that way, and I think we're thinking about it very carefully. I know when I mentioned the super before, I saw you cringe, David, because exactly we need to be looking after the retirement first and foremost. We fought for superannuation, and we need to protect it at all costs, not just from other governments, but from mismanagement as well, because it's fundamental that we all have a secure retirement. But we need to start thinking of innovative solutions that do that, because if we're going to sit around and wait for the banks to potentially start finding things that make them obsolete, I doubt they're going to come around real quick. So I think that it is our responsibility to start thinking of these solutions. Of course.
Shirley, I'm just thinking, your baby, your favourite baby amongst
Yes.
your four pillars,
Yes.
localisation is one of my favourite babies generally.
Yep.
I don't think we're going to get all of this out of the union movement, hopefully
No.
some good things will happen. But communities are open to
Absolutely.
the ideas. Race, our friend, and his supporters have been on about cooperatives. That Spanish example is like 50 years old.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we haven't seen much happen. There is a cooperative society in Australia.
Absolutely.
It stumbles. I am part of Hepburn Springs, a very
Yep.
tiny part, which is a cooperative.
Absolutely.
You have no idea how difficult it was to establish the bureaucratic obstacle course that a state government puts in place
Absolutely.
around the regulations for cooperatives. It's a nightmare. There are things we can do at a community basis alongside the unions might be doing with local governments,
Absolutely.
with regions.
Because unions should always be part of local communities, right? And I think that's part of what Janet was saying before. If we take the example of the old north of England, I mean, there's the union hall, there were union food shops, there were, the union was part of the community. I think we've seeded a little bit of that over time, but you're right, absolutely. The appetite is there for communities across the board. I don't think there's any disputation about that, but we need that institutional support to facilitate it, because exactly like you were saying, for those at home, Faye was talking about the experiences of the Hepburn Wind, and you've got a community battery out there as well in Hepburn.
Looking at it.
Looking
Going
at
to
it, that's
happen,
right.
hopefully. Yes.
Apologies.
Yes.
And just how many layers of bureaucracy and challenge there are to go along with it. And that's the same across the board, whether we're looking at, like I was using before, the case of a factory closing down and workers trying to say, we still want to be working in this industry and the community is behind it. Or whether it's in a very different way, trying to set up housing cooperatives in Australia, something which, per capita does a lot of work in the housing space as well. And again, watch this space because we've got some big news in that area. But we just currently don't have the legislative and institutional supports to facilitate it in an easy way. And that's absolutely what we need to be doing. It's like I was saying before, answering the previous two questions, that needs to be our role when we do have the institutional legislative power as a broader labour movement to be setting up the sorts of things that facilitate that. Because once we've got it, it's harder to put the genie back in the cork. But at the moment, well, we're back in the bottle, sorry. It's very, very, very hard to pull that cork off as well. So we need to make sure that is a politically viable path forward, and that's about community campaigns, it's about labour movement supporting. The other example that I point to in this space is the Hunter Jobs Alliance, which has been unions, environmental groups and community groups setting up a codified collective, an established place-based solution, which is around campaigning to make sure that the Hunter has better jobs, cleaner future and secure housing as well, making sure that all of those things are tied together in their local development plan. So I guess my answer is just like, yes, absolutely very agreement. So we've got one from Zoom, yeah.
The question is from George.
It's my friend George, here we go.
It says, democratizing management is something that can be accomplished by the German model that you mentioned before of co-determination, which has been shown to also have long-term economic benefits. Is there a strategy or any realistic way in which such a model can be implemented in Australia?
Yes, George, you know the answer to this is yes. This is one of my best friends, George, who's joining us online. That's right, that's absolutely a Dorothy Dixon. Yes, absolutely. Like, I think that it offers a very credible and real way forward. They're not hard reforms in terms of the legislative burden. We're changing a few lines to say that, you know, when we're talking about corporations of this size, that there are certain percentages of the board seats which must be decided by the workers of those areas. Again, I just wonder how much of the appetite there. We know that Wayne Swan has been talking about this very, very publicly. He's a big champion of it. We hope that his former chief of staff and now treasurer is also a fan of it. He certainly said a couple of things willing to explore it. So I think it really does come down to how much we want these things. So in my personal experience, any changes that are made are direct reflections of how widely a problem's felt and how deeply. If we can make sure that enough people believe that that is a credible solution, I think that it can happen. We know those of us who don't understand these problems, see the benefits of it, understand the research. But I don't think that, you know, if we go down the road on a Friday night and have a conversation with someone over a beer, I doubt that they're going to know that much about co-determination or understand why it leads to those long-term benefits that we know come from the German model. So I think it's up to organisations like this and community groups and the trade union movement to prioritise these things. And we can't change minds overnight. These are long-term processes. So we need to start building for that future right now. Even if we're not going to see those changes happen this term of government, next term of government, we need to start pushing for these bigger and better ideas. Janet, did you have a question?
I was just thinking, I had a terrific talk by Anthony Forsyth about the digital picket line.
Yes, yeah.
And I mean, Hospo Voice was so brilliant in doing that. And there are opportunities, and the technology and that does work with them. I mean, the really exciting one is that gamers,
Games Workers United, yes.
who are, you know, notoriously lonely people, solitary people, form the digital unions. And their workplace consists of one person that everyone treats with mild contempt. You know, so they, you know, this is a marvelous thing. So, you know, I can see, trying to think of the Labour Academy, this is also a venue that you can start seeding ideas, get the ideas, the discussions into branches.
Yes.
And get the whole thing. But the final point I want to make is that when I was looking at co-ops and looked in the agricultural area, they are burning in farming.
And they've always been there. My grandfather was a cooperative farmer for Golden Circle back in those days, used to be.
Yeah. Well, my great uncle started with the crushing mill, and they were French socialists. They knew that socialism worked. But there's a whole range of very complex sort of services going on in food production, which are co-ops, whether it's lobsters or whether there's a whole group that organise cheaper pet fuel and fuel that discounts and so on. That's booming, and they're very creative, and the capacity is there. And for this to be the community doing things rather than just relying on government, but getting what government has to provide is the security, the backstop. If something goes way up and people don't lose a lot of money. So that's actually what government wants to do.
Absolutely.
But rather than
And we've seen them do that in the for-profit sector plenty of times, whether it's in banking, whether it's in, like Qantas or whatever. So absolutely, we need to make sure that these are priorities. We could talk about this all day, comrades. I have zero doubts, but we are due to finish up in just a couple of minutes. Thank you. Well, so many great questions, such a great discussion. Like I say, I'm sure we could have kept talking about it. Just a couple of quick things. We haven't organised a speaker for the October series yet. There were a couple of scheduling errors, so we're trying to find a new speaker, and we'll get back to you on that. But in November, we've got Jenny Hocking, who'll be talking about the 50th anniversary of the Liquid Government, which will be absolutely fantastic. I'm sure we can all agree. So please join me in thanking all of our participants here today for joining in the conversation. And make sure that you keep keeping up with the newsletter. Bring along a friend, I might go on.
Can you subscribe? You can do a sales.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think everyone here wouldn't be here if they weren't already subscribed to our newsletter. Of course, you can go to our website. We've got the subscribe button up the top, no problems. You can also donate. Always welcome. Thank you very much. Small donations always help. Large donations help a whole lot as well.
Shirley, I don't understand. But Capita is a foundation.
Yeah.
Okay, and you can donate.
C&I.
It's really easy to do.
Oh, that's right. Yes, maybe I didn't explain the architecture. But Per Capita is the think tank, which we're all employed. Sam and Meredith are also here from Per Capita. Now, the Centre for New and Elizabeth C&I, we're just an applied research channel within Per Capita. So any donations to Per Capita will help us grow. This is the way we've been growing later on, is that we are starting to move into these applied research centres. So again, I watch this space kind of approach, but anything that anyone online or here today is willing to give will make a huge impact to the work that we're able to do. So
And is it tax deductible?
it is tax deductible, of course. We are. That's it. I haven't prepared for the donations pitch. I thought I was just much friends here. I didn't realise that it's Shark Tank all of a sudden. No, thank you all so much for joining us. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.